So now we get to the part of the transcendental aesthetic in which Kant talks about space. And as I said, there's going to be a part that talks about time a little later on, and it basically mirrors the part about space. Like the arguments about space, you sort of find them again in the part about time. And like most commentators, I am going to focus on the part about space. So, the transcendental aesthetic, first section on space. We here have two numbered paragraphs. Paragraph 2 gives us the metaphysical exposition of space, and paragraph 3 gives us the transcendental exposition of the concept of space, and then there are some conclusions from the above concepts. Now, of the metaphysical and the transcendental exposition, I again follow most recent commentators at least in believing that it's the metaphysical exposition that is the more important one. The transcendental exposition, and Kant tells us that what he means by that is he means the transcendental exposition of something is basically showing how that thing can ground a priori knowledge. So in the transcendental exposition of the concept of space, Kant is going to tell us how what he has just told us about space makes it possible to have a priori knowledge, synthetic a priori knowledge even, in geometry, which is nice. Some commentators have believed that this is actually the place where Kant is going to defend his theses about space by saying something like, oh, only on my theory of space can you explain geometry. But I'm going to, well, assume or believe or take it more or less for granted that that is not what is going on. Right? It is the metaphysical exposition of the concept of space in which Kant is going to tell us, give us the arguments for his main contention about space. And that main contention is that space is an a priori intuition. So an intuition, it's something through which we grasp an individual object in a very broad sense of object, to be sure. It's something through which we grasp an individual object, and it's a priori. We don't need experience, we don't need to wait on sensation, on empirical stuff, in order to have this grasp of space, in order to be in contact with space. And so this is basically for Kant like proving that space and later on time are a priori intuitions. That basically is for Kant what is going to show his transcendental idealism to be true. We'll talk about this later, but it follows very, very quickly for Kant from the fact that space and time are a priori intuitions that they are only about the human standpoint, the human point of view, the way that we are in touch with the world, and they do not apply to things in themselves, which is transcendental idealism, right? Or at least one of the main aspects or ingredients of ways of expostulating, explaining transcendental idealism. So what we might expect is that Kant, making a very controversial claim, because it's going to turn out that space isn't like something that applies to things in themselves, it's something that is only there from the human point of view, we might expect him to spend a lot of time arguing for that. And so it can come as quite a surprise, and indeed it is something that many, many commentators have commented upon, that the metaphysical exposition of space is actually very, very short. Right? Once we check out where the arguments start, like we've got arguments 1, 2, 3, and 4, it is one page in my Cambridge edition, my Cambridge translation of the work. It is one page, and maybe in Kant's own pagination it might be 2 pages, but it's one page. Okay, how is that possible? I mean, how can he get to this conclusion so quickly? Well, there are a couple of possibilities, and I want to briefly talk about them. One possibility is that Kant is just sort of in a rush, and so we will have a lot of work to do in trying to figure out what the real arguments are beneath this very rushed passage. And maybe that is true. And a lot of people have written very insightful articles and books even about the kinds of arguments that maybe Kant is trying to express here, even though he expresses them, well, all too briefly. So maybe that's true. A second way of thinking about this is that Kant is just sort of summarizing the arguments here because he can't really make them yet. And the idea here would be that Kant can't really make them yet because he really needs stuff from later in the book, especially stuff that we get when we start thinking about the understanding, in order to explain how we should think about space. Well, maybe, right? But that is really not the way that Kant seems to be setting up his book, so it would be kind of disappointing. And looking back to the first reason, I mean, maybe Kant is in a rush, but on the other hand, it's a pretty thick book, and there are a lot of topics that he talks about where he doesn't seem to be in much of a rush at all. So there's also a third possibility, and I would like to take it seriously, which is that Kant thought that it was actually kind of obvious that space is an a priori intuition and that this proves the transcendental ideality of space. But I want to take kind of seriously the option that Kant thinks that, well, once I set out the terms for you, you can just see it, right? It's really obvious. It's kind of clear, right? We don't need like sophisticated and long arguments because look, it's obvious. Now, what that means, taking that possibility seriously, is that I'm going to try to stay very close to the text. I'm not going to try to find sort of complicated arguments that are hidden by the text. I'm going to try to explain the text in such a way that you could say, oh yeah, maybe that's why Kant thinks it. Maybe that's why Kant might think this is obvious. And maybe we too end up thinking it's obvious or not. And especially if we think that it's not obvious, that's when all those more detailed commentaries are going to be important for us. And you should absolutely study them. But let's try a simple approach first. Okay, now, before getting to the full arguments, let's read the very beginning of the Metaphysical Exposition. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside us, and all as in space. What we should be aware of, if we want to have any chance of understanding what Kant is doing at all, is we should be aware of this difference between two ways of thinking about outer. Right? Kant is talking about outer sense, and then he's going to tell us that representing things in space is our human way of, our human form of outer sense. And if we think outer sense means spatially outside of us, then while this might be true, it also sounds tautological and very uninformative. Right? It would be something like saying, well, we humans, in order to represent something as spatially outside of us, need to represent it as spatially outside of us. That's not very enlightening. But that is not what Kant means. And in fact, Kant is making a very insightful and important point. And one way to see that is to think about Cartesian skepticism, which is such a great tool for understanding Kant at many junctures. So Cartesian skepticism is also called external world skepticism, right? So the Cartesian skeptic is somebody who is so impressed with this idea that we are only in touch with our own mental states, with our own ideas, that they end up believing that we can't know whether there is an external world. What is an external world? Well, strictly speaking, an external world is a world of objects that are not in the mind, right? That are independent of my mental processes, that are not elements of my mental processes, but that exist independently of that. That's what external means. So external, or außer here in the German of Kant, in this sense doesn't mean spatial or spatially outside of me. We're not talking about space at all. It means independent of me, not just my mental state. So external world skepticism, strictly speaking, is skepticism about whether there are any entities that are not my mental states. But we tend to immediately think of this as skepticism about whether there are any objects in space, whether there really is a space around me, whether there really are the objects that I think are in space. We are not worried about, like our mental entities. We're worried about the non-mental entities, and we immediately think about those non-mental entities as the spatially outside things, the things that are spatially outside of me. That's what Kant is pointing at. He says we human beings, when we represent something to ourselves as independent of us, as not part of our mental life, the way that we do that is we represent it as spatial, as spatially outside of us, as out there in space. So Kant is here pointing out this move that we automatically and unthinkingly tend to make when we think about something like external world skepticism, which is the move from not part of my mental life, existing independently of me, to being out there in space, right? And Kant says, yes, that is the way that we human beings think of things. That is the role that space plays in our thinking, in our conceiving of the world. Right? As soon as we conceive something as existing independently of us, we conceive of it as being in space. Certainly that is the case that whenever, I should maybe not use the word think here, whenever anything is given to us, right? Because we're talking about intuition. Whenever anything is given to us in intuition as existing independently, then it is given to us as spatial, right? Then it is a spatial intuition, that it is somewhere in space. Whenever something is given to us as not just part of my mental life, so when this thing is given to me as an independent object, hi Nietzsche, it is given to me as somewhere in space, right? That's the way the human mind works. All right, that is the human outer sense. Having clarified that, well, one thing we can immediately see is that space is very strange, right? When Kant is going to tell that space is an a priori intuition, so let's think about the a priori, right? It's supposed not to be empirical. Well, space is definitely very, very different from like the standard empirical things, which do not play this fundamental role, right? In order for something to be given as red to me, it's got to be red, that's okay, but red or, color in general doesn't really play any fundamental role in the constitution of our mental life, right? We don't need red, we don't need colors at all, any colors or the property of color in general, in order to think of things as existing independently of us, right? So there seems to be a very strong disanalogy between space on the one hand and other aspects of our, experience on the other hand. And the same thing is with some changes going to be true of time. Time is not something that we need to represent things outside of us. It's something that we need to represent things at all, right? Something can only be given to us as located in time, whether it's an outer object, like this Nietzsche bust, or whether it's an inner object, like my inner bliss at seeing this beautiful Nietzsche object and knowing that it's mine. That's not in space, that inner bliss, but it's in time, right? Everything has to be represented in time, and everything that exists independently of me has to be represented in space. Space and time really are very weird elements of our intuition, our experience, our whatever it is. And so Kant, I think this helps being aware of the weirdness of the position of space and time, their uniqueness, their singularity in a sense. I think this helps in understanding why Kant thinks that he just needs some quick pointers and reminders to show us that, yeah, space and time are really weird. We've got to think of them as radically different from anything else, namely as these a priori intuitions or a priori forms of sensibility. Okay, so let's go to these 4 arguments. And I'll start with argument 1, which I think is probably the most difficult of them all, though people might have different opinions about that. Argument 1 and 2 are supposed to show that space is a priori, and argument 3 and 4 are supposed to show that space is an intuition. Okay, so 1 and 2 are about a prioriness, a prioricity, I should say, and 3 and 4 are about being an intuition, intuitiveness, whatever. Let's read out argument 1. Space is not an empirical concept that has been drawn from outer experiences. In other words, it's a priori, right? It's not empirical. It's not something that we get from experiences. 4. In order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, that is, to something in another place in space from that in which I find myself, thus, in order for me to represent them as outside and next to one another, thus not merely as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already be their ground. Thus, the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearance through experience, but this outer experience is itself first possible only through this representation. Okay, what is Kant doing here? Now, there's one thing that Kant clearly cannot be doing, right? He can't be giving an argument that says something like, well, in order to represent something as spatial, you already need something like the concept of spatiality or space, and therefore these concepts, or whatever they are, must be a priori. Because if that's the whole story, then it seems like you could just as well say, well, in order to represent something as red, you've got to be able to, represent things as red. You need to have already this concept or idea or whatever it is of redness, and so that must be a priori. And of course, the colors are not supposed to be a priori, right? We're supposed to get them from experience, unlike space and time. Now, we already saw that space was very different from color, but what in this disanalogy is going to make Kant's argument go through? Right? For in order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, thus in order for me to represent them as outside and next to one another, thus not merely as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already be their ground. Thus the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearance through experience, but this outer experience is itself first possible only through this representation. Well, let me first read out what Sebastian Gardner has to say about that in Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason. Here is Gardner's gloss. So, Kant's argument must rather be the following. If the representation of space were not a priori, then it would be empirical. But if it were formed empirically, then it would be obtained from experience of outer objects. But this is impossible, since outer experience is impossible without the representation of space. So the representation of space must be a priori. In sum, because the representation of space is invoked in the very act of representing a world of outer objects, it cannot be based on experience of outer objects. Right? So what Gardner is saying is that if somebody tells us that we get the intuition of space from experience, like empirically, he's telling us that we get it from a world of outer objects. But the very thought of a world of outer objects only makes sense if we already have the representation of space. Right? That's what Kant's first point was, that outer and spatial for human beings, at least in the intuitions of human beings, turn out to be the same thing. Right? That to be given something as outside of us, we need to be given it as spatial. Maybe that is right. I'm not entirely sure. And one worry that you could have is that, well, this leaves open the possibility that we get these world of outer objects and the representation of space together, right? In experience, sort of, we get both of them. That might be possible. So I'm not saying that Gardner is wrong, but I'd like to explore some alternatives. Now, here is one alternative that I like. It requires us to make a distinction between, on the one hand, like spatial relations, like one thing is bigger than something else, or it's to the left of something else, and on the other hand, space, right? I mean, space, like this, right? Space. So suppose that we have experiences of color. I experience something as red. Okay. I experience something else as green. And I notice that these are different experiences. I experience yet something else as bluish green. Or I experience a bluish green thing, is maybe what I ought to be saying. And then I think, hey, that's yet another color. But this bluish green is a lot more like green than it's like red. And so maybe, as I get more experience, I start building up a sort of idea or feel for colors, even something like a kind of color space, maybe, that I don't start out with. And that seems to be entirely possible, right? This seems to be a pretty plausible story. That through experience, through empirical experience, I get more and more experiences of color, and at a certain point, I have a pretty complicated, full-bodied, sophisticated grasp of color, including ideas like colors being closer together or farther apart, something like a color space, and so on and so forth. Now, Kant might say that space is really very different, right? It can't be the case that we have some experience of one thing being to the left of something else while not having a grasp of space, right? And I don't mean this particular spatial relation, but I mean that in order to have an experience that involves one thing being to the left of something else, or in order to have an experience that involves one thing being bigger than something else, right? I see something small and something big. In order to represent that kind of thing to myself, I have to locate those objects or the part of those objects in space, right? This infinite, unlimited, whatever I should call it. Thing might not be the right word. But in order to represent spatial relations, I need already to have a representation of space. Space is not something, Kant might seem to be saying, that I can build up after having lots and lots and lots of individual experiences that involve particular spatial relations, and then through abstraction and thinking and comparing, at some point I come to the idea of, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's something that I ought to think of as space. No. In order to have any of those individual experiences, I already need a representation of this whole wherein they can be placed. Because all those individual experiences are ways of being placed in this whole. I think that might be the kind of thing that Kant is thinking of, right? For in order for certain sensations to be related to something outside of me, or next to each other, outside each other, and so on, the representation of space must already be their ground. Not the representation of being in different places, or the representation of being outside of one another, or any of these other like particular things, but the representation of space. So the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearance. These relations are the individual things, like being to the left of. You can't get space through those individual relations, because representing the relations requires you to already have the grasp of the whole. That the whole has to be given to you before you can represent these things that we actually find in experience. So that is actually going to fit pretty well with what we will read about space being an intuition in a little while. Okay, let's go to argument number 2. Space is a necessary representation a priori, that is, the ground of all outer intuitions. One can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. It is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as a determination dependent on them, and is an a priori representation that necessarily grounds outer appearances. So here Kant seems to be suggesting, telling us, and again, almost putting it forward as something that's obvious as the fact that I can't have an experience of left and right without having a grasp of space. He seems to be putting it forward as obvious that there is a kind of asymmetry between space and objects in space, right? And he might be particularly thinking of Leibniz here. Like Leibniz tells us that space is relational. Space is nothing but the relations that objects have to each other. And what Kant seems to be saying is, well, you can sort of represent to yourself the idea of empty space, right? You can sort of have this grasp of empty space with no objects in it. You couldn't possibly have a grasp of objects that aren't in space, right? That's impossible. And so the idea that objects could come before space, that we first have some grasp of objects and then through a grasp of their relations we sort of build up this idea of space, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Right? So again, Kant seems to be saying, look, just check out the role of space in our cognitive apparatus. Right? The space is there. It needs to be there before any object can be represented. And the objects don't need to be there in order for space to be represented. This really is sort of the fundamental thing. It's the form waiting for the matter. And the matter, the empirical matter, are the objects and their relations. And that's what we get through sensation. But this is the form that's already there. You can't think the matter without the form, although you can perfectly well sort of think the form without the matter. Later on, Kant is going to tell us that there couldn't really be empty space, and we actually, we couldn't really be in an empty universe. That doesn't make any sense for Kant. But here, when we're just thinking about intuition, well, this form of intuition can sort of be grasped before it's filled with matter. That doesn't seem to be very problematic. That means that we have a good reason to believe that space is this form of intuition that needs to be there as a condition of possibility for any particular sensation. So 1 and 2 both seem to tell us that if we check out the role of space in our actual experiencing, there's a very good case to be made that it is an a priori ingredient of that, and not something that we get through sensation itself. Okay, so space is a priori, but an a priori what? As we know, Kant has made the distinction between concepts on the one hand and intuitions on the other hand. An intuition is something through which we come in touch with an individual thing, right? An individual object is given to us. A concept is something general. We can think many individuals through concepts, right? By thinking about tree, the concept of tree, I can think about trees. I can make general claims about trees, but it never gives me an individual tree. What is space? Is it a concept? Is it something general under which we can have many individuals? Or is it more like the immediate grasp of an individual? Well, that is what arguments 3 and 4 are supposed to show us. 3. Space is not a discursive or as is said, general concept of relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. Okay, Kant tells us it's not a concept, it's an intuition. Why? For first, one can only represent a single space. And if one speaks of many spaces, one understands by that only parts of one and the same unique space. And these parts cannot, as it were, precede the single all-encompassing space as its components, from which its composition would be possible, but rather are only thought in it. It, space, is essentially single. The manifold in it, the manifold is like the the multiplicity in it, the manyness in it. The manifold in it, thus also the general concept of spaces in general, rests merely on limitations. Right? If we want to think about spaces, like the space in this room, how do I think about the space in this room? Well, I take space and then I put some, in fact, six limitations on it. And that is my idea of, hey, the space in this room. So Kant is saying space is essentially single. Yes, we can talk about spaces, but that is derivative, right? We first need to grasp space, the single, the individual, and then we can have a concept of space. That's okay. We maybe need that even to do geometry or to build houses, but that is later on. That's derivative from our original grasp of space. So it is essentially single. From this it follows that in respect to it, an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, grounds all concepts of it. Because an intuition is being in touch with something single, right? With something individual. And of course it has to be an a priori intuition that is not empirical because of what we saw in 1 and 2. But here Kant is telling us why it has to be an intuition. Thus also all geometrical principles, etc., are never derived from general concepts of line and triangle, but rather are derived from intuition, and indeed derived a priori with apodictic certainty. So the upshot of argument 3 is this thing that we can only represent a single space, and that the general concept of a space is merely a limitation of this one single space. If that is true, then space is not like a concept at all, and very much like an intuition. Right? Or our representation of space, I should say, is not like a concept, but like an intuition, because it brings us in touch with this single thing. Is Kant right? Well, yeah, I would say, right? I mean, when we think about space, it's this, right? It's this individual single thing, if that's the right word, in which I am. Okay, so I do seem to be in touch with something individual, right? With space. Which space? Well, this space, which is just space, right? I can't point at different spaces and say, oh, I actually mean that space. I'm just in space. All right, but, one might argue, is that really true? Right? Can't we, for instance, think of other possible worlds? And aren't those other possible worlds other possible spaces? And so isn't space, after all, a sort of concept? Well, I don't want to go into that in too much detail, because I think to really do justice to that would require lots and lots of subtleties. But here's one thing that maybe we can say in favor of Kant. The very word there, possible, right, another possible world, means that I'm not representing it as something actual, right? And so I'm not representing it as an object that I am or could be in touch with. Since we are thinking about, like, intuitions, like that space which is real, sorry, forget that I used the word intuition there. If we are thinking about the space which is real, right, which is actually relevant in order to get in touch with objects, in order to have any kind of knowledge, well, there's only one space, right? There's only one relevant space, and it doesn't really seem to be a discovery that, oh, you know, I mean, we've been really searching for where is our second or our third or our fourth space. No, I mean, we are in space, and there's not even a conceivable way of searching for another space, although, of course, we can construct in our minds maybe the idea of a different space, a different world. But that, again, seems to be kind of derivative, right? And it could be argued that the way that we do that is by thinking about putting different things in the world, right? Another possible world is a world where there just are different things, where different things are happening. We sort of think ourselves again in space, but this time a space populated with different things. Okay, I don't know whether that really does justice to the issue, but I do hope that you find some plausibility in this Kantian claim that space does seem to be this sort of individual thing that we find ourselves in, and that's not really sort of countable, or it doesn't really function like a concept at all. Okay, that again is what Kant is going to tell us in 4 here. 4. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations as their common mark, which thus contains these under itself. But no concept as such can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. Nevertheless, space is so thought, for all the parts of space, even to infinity, are simultaneous. Therefore, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition, not a concept. So here Kant is telling us something about the infinitude of space. Kant is actually not claiming that space is infinite. We're going to find out much later on in the antinomies that Kant doesn't think we can say that space is finite, and he doesn't think we can say that space is infinite. But what we can say is that space is unbounded, right? I mean, our concept of space requires that we can always extend it. We can always go on, right? There's never going to be a limit of space. That doesn't make any sense. Like there's space, and then what's beyond that? Well, we can only think of it as more space, right? So space is in this sense unbounded. It's in this sense infinite. Now, it contains smaller spaces inside it, in a sense, right? We can use these limits to get smaller parts of space. So we have this grasp of this unbounded space that contains all these smaller spaces within it, as many as we want, unlimitedly many. How does that relate to concepts? Well, Kant says, concepts can in one sense be infinite too. Like a concept is general, and that means that it sort of contains infinitely many representations under it. So take the concept of tree. We can think of infinitely many different trees. But those are examples of tree, right? They are sort of, there's the general concept, and then there are the individuals that fall under the concept, that are examples of a tree, that are particular trees. That is not the way in which space contains all these smaller spaces, right? They're really parts of it. Now, a concept can have parts too, right? A concept can have parts too. So, for instance, the concept of the concept of a factory. The concept of a factory might be the concept of a building in which things are made on an industrial scale, right? Maybe that's the concept of a factory. It's a building where things are made on an industrial scale. So this concept of a factory has parts. Building, things are made, that probably has some parts. On an industrial scale, that probably has some parts too. So there's some parts here, but finitely many. Because, Kant says, no concept can contain an infinite set of representations within itself. If it did, if I had to grasp infinitely many concepts in order to grasp this concept, it wouldn't be a concept, right? I couldn't do that. You can't have a concept that is infinitely complex, that requires infinitely many rules to be satisfied before something can be said to fall under it. So, although concepts can contain parts, other concepts, they can only contain finitely many of them. Whereas space contains infinitely many subspaces, right? Or at least unlimitedly many subspaces. So again, it seems that space is more like an intuition than like a concept, because that things given in intuition can contain sort of indefinitely many parts. That is unproblematic. Take my Nietzsche statue again. How many parts does it have? Well, you can zoom in and see lots of details and zoom in on those details, and maybe those have lots of details, and there's nothing problematic about the assumption that you can keep on doing this, right? That there's always some more detail to be found in this individual thing. So individual things containing infinitely many parts, that doesn't seem to be problematic as such. Concepts containing infinitely many parts does seem to be problematic. So again, Kant says, given that space either has to be an intuition, the representation of space either has to be an intuition or a concept, it definitely seems to be an intuition and not a concept. So, again, what has Kant been telling us? And I'm going to try to summarize this, and I'm going to try to make it, again, sort of sound obvious, as I think it sounds obvious to Kant. And it took me 40 minutes to tell you why it's obvious, which suggests that maybe it's not that obvious, but anyway. Space is this one thing, right? This individual thing that we find ourselves in, or at least that we find ourselves using to represent things, to represent our experiences, all the experiences of things that we experience as not being part of ourselves, as being independent of us. And we couldn't represent any of those individual experiences, without referring them to this one full, large, unlimited entity, space. That's weird. Space seems to be something that is grasped immediately, in its entirety, and as an individual. The individual part suggests that it's an intuition, and the fact that we grasp it immediately and in its entirety, even though it is unlimited, seems to suggest that it is a priori, that it is a form of sensibility and not something given in any of those limited sensations that we have. And so space is, for Kant, an a priori intuition. Period. That, I think, is the thought, the way of thinking that Kant is presenting to us here. Now, is that enough to show that space is transcendentally ideal? We've got to think about that more.